She gave birth to twins alone in the middle of a burning desert. No roof above her, no one by her side. Only the ruthless sun, the dry wind, and the silence of death. Eleanor May Whitlock was just 22 years old. Her father had promised her a safe place. He swore it on her mother's grave. Her brother Jacob even smiled, a rare thing these days, and told her everything would finally be okay. They loaded her onto the wagon, the floor padded with old blankets, and headed east, away from the prying eyes of the town, away from the shame they said she'd brought upon them. But when the wagon reached the edge of the great empty wasteland, where the world cracked open under the heat, they stopped. Her father wouldn't look at her. He just stared at the horizon. "Get down," he said, his voice flat, like a stone skipping on dead water. She thought it was a rest stop. She thought they were just watering the horses. So she did as she was told, her swollen belly making every movement a struggle. She stepped down onto the hot sand, and then her brother flicked the reins. The horses lurched forward. The wagon rolled away. They didn't look back, not once. At first her mind refused to see what was happening. It was a joke, a cruel test of her nerve. They'd be back in a minute, laughing. They had to come back. They were her family. But the sound of the hooves grew fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the immense, buzzing silence of the desert. And in that silence she heard a new sound, the distant, hungry howl of coyotes. That's when the truth hit her like a physical blow. They had abandoned her. To them, she was not a daughter. She was not a sister. She was a stain on their name, and this desert was their wash basin. They were leaving her here to be erased by the sun and the sand and the scavengers. The shock was so immense she couldn't even scream. Her legs gave out, and she fell to her knees, her hands flying to her belly, a reflexive, useless gesture of protection. She prayed this was all a nightmare. But the nightmare was just beginning. A sharp, wet agony tore through her. Her water broke, soaking the front of her dress and mixing with the dust. The pain came immediately after, a wave of pure fire that ripped through her insides without mercy. She screamed then, a raw animal sound that the desert simply swallowed. No one answered. No one was there to answer. Hours bled into one another. The sun beat down, turning the air into a furnace. The desert floor beneath her simple cotton dress turned dark with her blood. She clawed at the dirt, her fingernails breaking, just trying to anchor herself to a world that was slipping away. When the first child came out, a slick, shocking rush, she nearly blacked out. The world went gray at the edges. But then she heard it, a tiny, impossibly fragile cry that pulled her back from the brink. With trembling hands, she found a sharp piece of glass in the sand, a remnant of some other forgotten tragedy, and cut the cord. Her body was a wreck. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, but there was no time to rest. Another wave of fire seized her. The second baby was coming. She bit down on the sleeve of her own dress, stifling a scream that would have torn her throat raw. Blood poured from her hot and fast. The world blurred into a haze of heat and pain and shimmering light. And then another sound. A second weak cry joining the first. She had done it. She gathered both infants into her arms, pressing their tiny, perfect faces to her chest. They were here. They were alive. But for how long? Eleanor looked around. The horizon was a merciless, unbroken line in every direction, nothing but cactus and stone. The sun was finally sinking, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sand. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and something else, the smell of death. Her body was broken, her strength was gone, but her arms tightened around her newborns. If she died here, they would die with her, and she swore, in a voice that was barely a whisper, that she would not let that happen. She tried to stand, her legs shaking uncontrollably, and collapsed back into the sand. The bruises on her thighs and shoulders, gifts from days before her departure, throbbed with a dull, constant ache. One of her eyes was swollen almost completely shut. Her body was a road map of cruelty and pain, but there was one fragile thread holding her together. "The will of a mother," she whispered to the two tiny bundles in her arms. "You will live, even if I do not." Her own tears mixed with the blood and the grime on her face as the cold of the desert night began to creep in. The coyotes howled again, closer this time. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what that sound meant. They could smell her. They could smell the blood. She was alone, unarmed, and bleeding. A perfect meal. All she had in the world were two tiny lives pressed against her chest. The last sliver of daylight vanished, and the stars blinked on in the cold, black sky, indifferent and far away. Her breaths grew shallow. Her vision began to darken at the edges again. But still, she held the babies tight, rocking them gently, humming a broken lullaby her own mother used to sing to her. Her voice cracked and failed, but the babies stirred, their soft cries cutting through the night. It was a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful, because they were alive. Terrifying, because every small cry was a beacon, drawing the predators of the night closer and closer. Somewhere in that endless, crushing silence, Eleanor closed her eyes and asked the only question that was left. Would anyone find them before the desert finished what her own family had started? Her legs were shaking so hard she could barely feel them. Her bare feet were sliced open by sharp rocks and cactus thorns, but Eleanor kept walking, clutching the two newborns against her chest like a shield. Every step she took left a dark smear of her own blood in the sand. She knew she was going to fall soon. She knew she couldn't last, yet she kept moving, whispering to the babies with each ragged breath. "Just a little farther. Just hold on with me." That's when she saw him. He emerged from the fading light like a ghost, a lone rider on a dark horse. His hat was pulled low, and a red scarf covered the bottom half of his face. His horse shifted, uneasy at the scent of blood in the air, its ears pricked back. But the man pulled it steady with a calm, sure hand. He just watched her for a long moment, a statue in the twilight. He saw a girl who was barely a woman, her face swollen and bruised, her dress torn and stained with the evidence of birth and near death, carrying two crying infants like they were the only thing holding the world together. Marshall Boone had seen his share of hardship out on the plains, but he had never seen a sight that burned itself into his soul quite like this. She was walking straight into her own grave, yet she refused to set the babies down. He guided his horse closer, the animal stepping carefully around her. "You keep on like that," he said, his voice plain and rough like the land itself. "You're going to drop." Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. They were too cracked, too dry. She tried again. "Then let me drop," she rasped. "But not them." Something in those 4 words, in the raw, stubborn defiance of them, pulled at Marshall harder than any job he'd ever taken, harder than any order he'd ever followed. Without a second thought, without weighing the trouble she would surely bring, he swung down from his saddle. He reached for her arm, and his hand was rough but steady. The moment he touched her, she nearly collapsed into him, her strength finally giving out. But she still did not let go of the children. Marshall could feel how light she was, a bundle of sticks and sheer will. He could feel how close she was to the edge. There was no time for questions. He lifted her onto the saddle as if she weighed nothing, then carefully took the twins from her, settling their small, warm bodies against the front of his worn coat. He swung up behind her, his presence a solid wall at her back. The horse shifted, then started west under his gentle command, heading toward the only place he could take them, his ranch. A quiet, lonely spread of land at the foot of the hills, where he had been living half a life, all alone. The ride was slow, lit only by the cold light of the stars and a thin slice of moon. The babies whimpered. The mother whispered nonsense to them, and Marshall kept his eyes sharp, scanning the darkness for the glint of coyote eyes. When they finally reached the small cabin, he carried them inside. It was no palace, just rough timber walls, a stone hearth that smelled of old fires, and the faint, comforting scent of horses from the nearby shed. But it was safe, and it was his. He laid the babies in a wooden cradle he had carved with his own hands years ago for a life he never got to live. He gave Eleanor water from his well, a little at a time, and covered her with a thick wool blanket. And for the first time in more years than he could count, Marshall Boone felt the heavy silence of his life begin to break. "You're safe here," he said. She could only nod weakly, her eyes fluttering closed, her hands still reaching for the babies even in her exhaustion. What Marshall didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that this single act of mercy had just sealed his fate. This night would bind their lives together in ways he never imagined. And that soon, this broken girl would beg him for something far harder than a ride out of the desert. She would ask him to help her find the man who had abandoned her, the man who had fathered those twins. But Marshall already had a cold suspicion in his gut. He had a feeling he knew exactly who that man was. And if he was right, then he hadn't just saved a woman and her children. He had just declared war. Eleanor stayed at the ranch for weeks. Her body healed slowly, the bruises on her skin fading from a violent purple to a sickly yellow, and then disappearing altogether. But the scars inside, the ones left by her own family, only seemed to cut deeper. Marshall said little. He wasn't a man for words, but his actions spoke a language she was starting to understand. He fetched water from the well without being asked. He cooked simple meals of beans and bread and left them by her bedside. And every night, when she was so tired she could barely stand, he would take one of the twins and rock the baby to sleep on the porch, his large, calloused hand gentle against its tiny back. The cabin, which had been silent for so many years, was now filled with the cries of babies, the soft creak of the rocking chair, and the quiet sounds of a life returning. But not all wounds heal with time and kindness. Every evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Eleanor's gaze would drift east, back toward the world that had cast her out. She still thought of him. Miguel, the man who had once whispered promises to her under the cottonwood trees by the river. The father of her children. The man who, in some small, foolish part of her heart, she still hoped might be out there, searching for her. One night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, she finally found her voice. "Please," she said, looking at Marshall, her eyes pleading, "please, help me find him." Marshall didn't answer right away. He just stared into the flames, his face a mask of shadows. He knew that look in her eyes. It was a dangerous cocktail of hope and desperation. He had worn that same look himself once, a long time ago, chasing after someone who never intended to be caught. He knew this road only led to more pain. He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to tell her to forget Miguel, to build a new life here where it was safe. But he looked at her, at the raw hope in her face, and he looked at the two babies sleeping in the cradle, and he couldn't deny her. He knew what it felt like to need an answer, even if it was the one you didn't want to hear. So he gave a single, slow nod. The journey was long and rough. They passed through blinding dust storms and picked their way through broken, sun-scorched canyons. They rode through small, dusty towns where strangers measured you with cold, hard eyes. Eleanor held her babies close, whispering lullabies to them when the nights grew too long and the world felt too big. Marshall rode steady beside her, his eyes always moving, always watchful. But his silence grew heavier and heavier the closer they got to the borderlands. It was a silence filled with something dark, something he wasn't sharing. And then one afternoon, in a town that smelled of cheap whiskey and gunpowder, they found him. "Miguel." He was leaning against a saloon post, laughing with a group of men who looked like they were paid to cause trouble. His hair was longer than she remembered, his clothes were finer, and his smile was wide and careless. He looked like a man without a single worry in the world. But then his eyes drifted across the street and met Eleanor's. And that easy smile froze on his face. She stepped forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break right out of her chest. The whole world seemed to shrink down to the dusty space between them. "Miguel," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She held the babies up slightly. "These are your children." For a long, terrible moment, the world seemed to stop. The twins whimpered in her arms, their tiny fists curling and uncurling. Miguel looked at them, his eyes wide. Then he looked at her plain, travel-worn dress and her tired face. And he laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut the air like a whip. "Those aren't mine," he said, loud enough for all his friends to hear. "I don't know who you are, lady. I owe you nothing." The words were more brutal than any physical blow. Eleanor felt her knees buckle, and only Marshall's hand on her arm, appearing from nowhere, kept her from falling to the ground. Miguel turned his back on them, waving them off as if she were nothing more than a stray dog begging for scraps. He was gone. The man she had carried in her heart for so long, he didn't exist anymore. In his place stood a coward, a man who feared responsibility more than he feared death. Marshall's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like ropes. He wanted to walk across that street and tear that smug look off Miguel's face, but he held back. This wasn't the place. Not yet. What they didn't know was that a man was watching from the second-story window of that saloon. A man with cold eyes and a scar that ran down his cheek. He watched Eleanor's face crumble. He watched Marshall's hand clench into a fist. And then he turned from the window and walked away. He had seen enough. He had to send a message to his boss. The problem they thought they had buried in the desert had just walked back into the world, and it had brought an old ghost with it. What happened in that dusty street was only the spark. Soon, fists would fly, blood would spill, and Eleanor would finally see who truly stood by her side. And far more importantly, she would learn that her abandonment wasn't a simple act of cruelty by a cowardly lover. It was the first move in a much larger, more dangerous game. And she and her children were the pawns. Miguel's cruel laugh was still hanging in the hot, dusty air when Marshall took a step forward. He had held his tongue. He had held his temper. But he had held them long enough. The way Miguel had looked at Eleanor, like she was nothing, like she was dirt on his fine new boots, was more than Marshall could stomach. Miguel turned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "What now, old man?" he sneered. "You want to play the hero?" The men around him chuckled, eager for a show. They leaned against the porch posts, rolling cigarettes, ready to watch the old rancher get put in his place. But Marshall didn't answer with words. His fist answered for him. The punch was short and brutal, cracking across Miguel's jaw with the sound of breaking wood. It sent him stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard in the street. The crowd of onlookers let out a collective roar, a mix of shock and delight. Miguel spat a mouthful of blood and dirt, his eyes blazing with surprise and rage. He lunged to his feet, a wild animal, and crashed into Marshall. The two men became a whirlwind of flying fists and kicking boots, the dust rising up around them in a choking cloud. Eleanor clutched the babies tight, her heart pounding in her throat. She was torn between a deep, primal fear and a strange, rising sense of hope. Someone was finally fighting for her. Miguel swung wild, his punches fueled by rage and humiliation. But Marshall fought with a grim, steady purpose. Years of hard ranch work and a lifetime of forgotten trail fights had made him strong in a way Miguel, with his soft hands, could never understand. Miguel landed a lucky blow to Marshall's ribs, and the older man grunted in pain. But he didn't fall. He didn't even stumble. He came back with a heavy right hand that seemed to come from the earth itself, and it dropped Miguel to his knees. The saloon doors banged open and more men poured out, their faces eager for violence. They formed a circle, shouting bets, egging them on. Miguel scrambled up, his hand snatching for the ornate pistol at his belt. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. This was no longer a fist fight. But before he could even clear the holster, Marshall's boot came down like a hammer, kicking the weapon out of his hand and sending it skittering into the dust. "No guns," Marshall said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "Fight like a man." They traded more blows, raw and punishing. Blood and sweat mixed with the dirt, turning to mud on their faces. Miguel's pride was the only thing keeping him on his feet, but Marshall's quiet, relentless grit was wearing him down, piece by piece. Finally, Miguel sagged against a hitching post, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a desperate, cornered hate. Marshall grabbed him by the collar of his fancy shirt, hauling him close. "You threw away a woman who would have walked through fire for you," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't deserve her, and you will never deserve them." He let go, and Miguel crumpled to the ground, a broken, defeated heap. The crowd fell silent. Even the drunkest gambler in the circle knew they had just witnessed more than a fight. They had seen a reckoning. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but not of sorrow this time. They were tears of truth. The man she once thought she loved was gone, if he had ever existed at all. The man who stood before her now, bloodied but unbroken, had done more for her and her children in a few weeks than Miguel ever would in a lifetime. Miguel crawled away like a wounded dog, clutching his shattered pride. No one stopped him. No one offered him a hand. All eyes were on Marshall, standing tall and breathing hard in the fading light. But this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. Because as Marshall turned back toward Eleanor, he saw it. Over her shoulder, down the far end of the street, a rider was sitting on a horse, perfectly still, just watching them. The man was too far away to see his face, but Marshall didn't need to. He recognized the horse. He recognized the silver conchos on the saddle. It was a message. They knew he was here. His past had finally caught up with him, and now it had caught up with Eleanor, too. The hardest choice still lay ahead. And it had nothing to do with letting go of the past. It had everything to do with surviving the present. The dust had settled. Miguel was gone, his shadow swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Eleanor stood clutching her babies, her eyes locked on Marshall as he wiped a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the fear in her chest had been replaced by something else, something solid and calm. It felt like the storm that had been raging inside her had finally broken. They left that town before the sun was even a rumor in the east. They rode hard, not looking back. The trail was quiet, the sky painted with the soft, gentle light of a new day. And for the first time on their journey, the twins slept soundly in her arms. Eleanor looked over at Marshall, at the grim, set line of his jaw as he guided the horse with a steady hand. This man had fought for her, not with pretty words and whispered promises, but with his hands and his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't turn to look at her. He just gave a short, sharp nod. But in that small gesture, she felt the weight of his protection, and she just knew, they were not heading back to the quiet safety of the ranch. They were running from something. Her suspicion was confirmed that night. They didn't make a fire. Marshall led them to a hidden alcove in the rocks, a place that was nearly invisible from the main trail. He stood watch the entire night, his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt watchful. Days turned into a desperate, nerve-wracking blur. They traveled on winding, forgotten paths, avoiding towns, avoiding people. Marshall was no longer just a rancher. He was a tracker, a survivor. He moved with a purpose that frightened her, reading signs in the dirt she couldn't see, listening to sounds she couldn't hear. One afternoon, as they rested the horse by a hidden spring, she saw him freeze. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked. Then she heard it too, the distant sound of horses moving fast. In an instant, he had her and the babies off the horse, pulling them behind a cluster of boulders. He drew his pistol, his movements fluid and practiced. He was no stranger to this. Two riders thundered past on the trail below, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the terrain. On the flank of each horse was a brand she had never seen before, a cruel-looking K shaped like a twisted spur. The riders passed, their dust settling in the still air. But the fear they left behind was thick and cold. "Who are they?" Eleanor demanded, her voice a harsh whisper. "Why are they following us?" Marshall finally looked at her, his face grim. The time for half-truths was over. "They're not following us," he said, his voice low. "They're hunting us. They work for a man named Silas Kane, Miguel's father." Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing, trying to put the pieces together. "Miguel's father? Why would he—" "Because you were never supposed to survive the desert," Marshall cut in, his words like chips of ice. "When Miguel found out you were pregnant, he went to his father. Kane doesn't like loose ends. He doesn't like scandals that could tarnish his name, especially not now. He's trying to marry Miguel off to the daughter of the cattle baron from the next county over. A stain like you and his bastard grandchildren would ruin the deal." The pieces slammed into place with dizzying, sickening force. Her abandonment wasn't a crime of passion or shame from her own family. It was a business transaction. Her father and brother hadn't just been cruel. They'd been paid. "My family," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "Kane owns half the territory," Marshall said, his eyes dark with a history she was only just beginning to glimpse. "He owns ranchers, sheriffs, and souls. Your father was probably deep in his debt. Kane offered him a way out. All he had to do was get rid of you." The world tilted on its axis. The betrayal of her family was one thing, but to know that she and her children were just collateral damage in some rich man's business deal. It was a cold, empty feeling that hollowed her out completely. She looked at Marshall, at the way he held his gun, at the haunted look in his eyes, and a new, terrifying question began to form. "How do you know all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do you know so much about Silas Kane?" Marshall was silent for a long moment, the sounds of the wilderness pressing in around them. He holstered his pistol, the click echoing in the stillness. "Because for 10 years, he said, and he finally met her gaze. I was the man he sent to collect those debts. I was his enforcer." The ground beneath Eleanor's feet seemed to vanish. The man who had saved her from the desert, the man who had protected her and fought for her, had once been a part of the very same machine that had tried to grind her into dust. He had worked for the monster who ordered her death. She took an involuntary step back, clutching her children tighter. He saw the fear and betrayal in her eyes, and a look of profound pain crossed his own face. "It was a long time ago, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I'm not that man anymore." But as the sound of distant riders echoed through the canyons again, this time from a different direction, they both knew the truth. It didn't matter who he was now. Silas Kane was coming. And when you worked for a man like Kane, the past was never really the past. It was just a debt, waiting to be collected in blood. They were trapped. The world had shrunk to the size of this rock-strewn canyon. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, terrifying silence. The man who had saved her life had once been one of them, the monster's right hand. Could she trust him? Did she have a choice? The sound of approaching riders grew louder, closer. They were being boxed in. "Give me one of the babies," Marshall said, his voice calm, cutting through her panic. He didn't wait for an answer, just gently took the sleeping infant from her left arm. "We have to move. Now, stay low and do exactly as I say." He led her away from the spring, scrambling up a narrow, hidden trail between two massive boulders. It was a path she never would have seen on her own. He moved with a speed and certainty that was terrifying. This was his world, the world of the hunted. They found a small overhang, a shallow cave barely deep enough to conceal them. He pushed her inside, pressing her back against the cool rock. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his eyes scanning the canyon floor below. "No matter what you hear." He took up a position near the mouth of the cave, pulling his rifle from the scabbard on his horse, which he had left tethered in a thicket of mesquite. He was a different person now. The quiet, gentle rancher was gone. In his place was a killer. The riders entered the canyon below, 4 of them. They carried rifles and moved with the easy confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. They all wore the brand of the Twisted K. Eleanor held her breath, pressing her baby so tightly to her chest that the child let out a tiny, questioning whimper. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She quickly offered the baby her knuckle to suckle, praying it would be enough. Down below, one of the riders heard it. He reined in his horse, his head tilting, listening. "Did you hear that?" he called out to the others. "Just a coyote pup," another answered dismissively. "Let's check by the spring. The tracks led this way." They dismounted, leaving one man with the horses, and began to search the area where Eleanor and Marshall had been just minutes before. Eleanor watched, her body rigid with fear. Marshall was as still as the rock he leaned against, his rifle aimed, his finger resting on the trigger. He wasn't going to let them find her. He was going to kill them all, right here. And in that moment, she didn't care who he used to be. All she cared about was the safety of her children. One of the men was getting closer to their hiding spot. He was looking up, his eyes scanning the rocks. He was going to see them. Any second now, his eyes would land on the dark opening of the cave. Marshall slowly, silently, cocked the hammer on his rifle. The sound was almost imperceptible, but in the tense silence, it felt like a thunderclap. The man below heard it. His eyes snapped up, locking directly onto their position, his mouth open to shout a warning. He never got the chance. Marshall's rifle bucked against his shoulder. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the canyon like the wrath of God, and the man below crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. All hell broke loose. The other 2 men dove for cover, firing their own rifles wildly up at the cave. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the opening, sending chips of stone flying. Eleanor screamed, shielding her baby with her own body. Marshall worked the lever on his rifle with practiced efficiency, firing again. Another man cried out and fell silent. The third man, the one guarding the horses, was smarter. He grabbed the reins of his comrades' mounts and took off, galloping back down the canyon the way he came, leaving his partners for dead. The last remaining gunman was pinned down behind a rock. He and Marshall traded shots, the canyon ringing with the sound of gunfire. Eleanor knew they were still in terrible danger. The man who escaped would bring back reinforcements. They had to get out of here. But how? They were trapped on this ledge with only one way down. And then she heard a new sound, a different sound, the sharp crack of a rifle, but from a different location, higher up, on the opposite rim of the canyon. The gunman who had Marshall pinned down suddenly jerked, then fell over sideways. A new plume of smoke rose from the cliff top across from them. Someone else was out there. Someone was helping them. Marshall stared at the spot where the shot had come from, his face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Was it a bounty hunter, a rival of Kane's? And then a figure stood up on the ridge, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but they raised a hand, not in a wave, but a clear signal. Then they turned and disappeared. "Who was that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Marshall didn't answer. He was already scrambling down the path, his gun ready, his eyes scanning for any other threats. "We're leaving," he said, his voice grim. "Now." He didn't know who their mysterious savior was, but he knew one thing for sure. In this territory, no one did anything for free. They had just traded one enemy for a new unknown variable, and that might be even more dangerous. As they rode away, leaving the dead men to the buzzards, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she knew the way that distant figure had stood, the set of their shoulders. It was a long shot, a crazy thought, but it looked like her brother. The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Jacob. It had to be. No one else would have a reason to help them. But why? After what he'd done, after leaving her to die, it made no sense. They rode for hours, Marshall pushing the horse and themselves to their limits. He didn't speak of the mysterious shooter on the ridge, and Eleanor kept her suspicions locked away in her heart. She didn't know if telling him would help or hurt. That night they found shelter in an abandoned line shack, a crumbling relic from a forgotten cattle drive. It wasn't much, but it had 4 walls and a roof. As Marshall stood guard outside, Eleanor tended to the babies by the light of a single flickering candle. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Was Jacob trying to atone for his sins? Or was this part of some other, more complicated trap? The answer came just after midnight. A soft rustle outside the shack brought Marshall to full alert, his pistol in his hand in an instant. "I'm not here to fight," a voice called out from the darkness. A young man's voice, strained and cracking with exhaustion. I need to talk to her." Eleanor's heart stopped. She knew that voice. Marshall didn't lower his gun. "Come into the light." Slowly. Her brother, Jacob, stepped into the faint candlelight that spilled from the doorway. He looked years older than he had just a few weeks ago. His face was thin and gaunt, his eyes haunted. He held his hands up, showing they were empty. "Jacob," Eleanor breathed, 1,000 emotions warring inside her. Anger, relief, confusion. He wouldn't look at her. He stared at the dirt floor. "I followed you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I saw what they did at the wagon. I couldn't live with it. I came back the next morning, but you were gone. I found your tracks and the blood, and the other tracks. The horse. I've been following ever since." "You shot that man in the canyon," Marshall stated, his voice flat, his gun still steady. Jacob nodded, finally looking up. His eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading shame. "I had to. They would have killed you." He looked at Eleanor. "They were sent to finish the job. Cain was furious when he heard you were still alive." He took a shaky breath, and the whole story came pouring out of him. Their father was ruined, deep in debt to Silas Cain. Cain had been buying up all the small ranches, strangling them one by one. Their father was the last holdout. Cain offered him a deal, forgive the debt, even give him a prime piece of grazing land. The price was Eleanor and her unfortunate condition. Their father, a broken and bitter man, had agreed. "He told me it was the only way to save our home," Jacob choked out, tears streaming down his face. "He said you were a stain on our mother's memory. I went along with it. God help me, I drove the wagon." Eleanor felt the anger drain out of her, replaced by a cold, weary pity. Her family hadn't betrayed her out of simple cruelty. They had been victims too, caught in the same web as she was. "Cain knows you're with him," Jacob said, looking at Marshall. "The man who got away from the canyon, he rode straight to the main ranch. He told Cain everything. He described you. Cain knows his old ghost is back." A chill went through the small shack. "He's not sending men after you anymore," Jacob said, his voice trembling with a new urgency. "He's coming himself. He's gathering all his riders. He's going to ride to your ranch, Marshal. He's going to burn it to the ground and kill anyone who stands in his way." The finality of his words hung in the air. This wasn't a chase anymore. It was an extermination. Marshal finally lowered his pistol. His face was set like granite. "How long do we have?" "A day, maybe 2, Jacob answered. "He's not rushing. He's enjoying this." The choice was clear. They could run, spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the twisted K-riders to appear on the horizon. Or they could make a stand. Marshall looked at Eleanor, his eyes asking a silent question. She was no longer the broken girl he'd found in the desert. She had faced death and betrayal and had not broken. She looked back at him, then at her sleeping children, and then at her broken brother. This was her fight, too. These men, this monster Cain, had tried to wipe her and her children from the face of the earth. She wouldn't run from them anymore. "We go back to the ranch," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We make our stand there, on our own ground." Marshall nodded slowly, a grim light in his eyes. It was a suicide mission. 3 people, one of them barely a man, against a small army of hired killers. But it was their only chance. "Jacob," Marshall said, his voice hard, "you helped them leave your sister for dead. Now you have a chance to make it right. Can you fight?" Jacob looked at his sister, at the children he had almost condemned to death, and a fire of resolve burned away his tears. "I can," he said. And so the desperate, unlikely alliance was formed. They would race back to Marshall's small, lonely ranch, not to hide, but to turn it into a fortress. Silas Cain was coming for a war. They would be ready to give him one. The ride back to the ranch was a frantic, desperate race against time. They pushed the horses to their limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Every shadow on the trail looked like one of Cain's riders. Every gust of wind sounded like the thunder of approaching hooves. The quiet peace of Marshall's land was gone, replaced by the grim reality of what was coming. When they finally saw the small cabin nestled at the foot of the hills, it didn't look like a sanctuary anymore. It looked like a tomb. They had less than a day. There was no time for rest. They immediately set to work, turning the simple homestead into a makeshift fortress. Marshall, Eleanor, and Jacob moved with a feverish energy, fueled by adrenaline and the shared knowledge that their lives depended on it. Marshall, with his cold, practical knowledge of violence, took charge. "Jacob, you take the axe. Fell those saplings by the creek. We need to reinforce the door and window shutters. Eleanor, start filling every bucket, every pot, every container we have with water. If they try to burn us out, it'll buy us time." Eleanor worked tirelessly, her muscles screaming in protest, but she didn't stop. With every bucket of water she hauled from the well, she felt her fear turning into a hard, cold resolve. They had tried to erase her. They would not succeed. She placed the babies in the cradle in the darkest corner of the cabin, praying they would sleep through the coming storm. Jacob chopped wood with a frantic, desperate strength, the sound of the axe echoing through the quiet valley. Every swing was an act of penance. He was no longer the weak boy who had followed his father's cruel orders. He was a man trying to earn back his soul. They barricaded the windows, leaving only small slits to fire through. They reinforced the heavy oak door with an iron bar from the forge. Marshall brought in his arsenal: 2 rifles, his pistol, and a heavy-gauge shotgun. He laid out the ammunition on the main table, a grim feast of brass and lead. "Jacob, have you ever fired a rifle?" Marshall asked, his tone all business. "Some. Hunting," Jacob admitted. "You're not hunting deer anymore," Marshall said, handing him a rifle. "Aim for the chest. Don't waste shots." He turned to Eleanor. "You too. You need to know how to reload these, all of them." He showed her how to work the mechanisms, his hands moving with a swift, sure competence. She learned quickly, her hands steady, her mind clear. The terrified girl from the desert was well and truly gone. In her place was a mother protecting her young, a lioness. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the land, they finished their work. The ranch was as ready as it could be. They gathered inside the now darkened cabin, the silence thick with unspoken fear and anticipation. The attack came at dawn. It wasn't a subtle approach. Silas Kane wanted them to see him coming. A line of 20 riders appeared on the ridge, dark silhouettes against the blood-red morning sky. They moved slowly, deliberately, an army of black-hatted demons coming to claim their due. They surrounded the small cabin, a noose tightening around its neck. And then the shooting started. The first volley of bullets tore into the wooden walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying. Eleanor, crouched below a window, flinched but didn't scream. She crawled over to the cradle, whispering reassurances to the now crying infants. "It's our turn," Marshall said calmly, raising his rifle to one of the firing slits. The battle for the ranch had begun. It was a brutal, relentless onslaught. Kane's men charged on horseback, firing as they came, trying to overwhelm the cabin's defenses. But Marshall was a master tactician. He had chosen his ground well. "Hold your fire until they're close," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Make every shot count." The first rider who got too close was blasted from his saddle by Marshall's shotgun. The second was taken down by a clean shot from Jacob's rifle. They fought back with a ferocity that surprised their attackers. But there were too many of them. For hours, the siege raged. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Bullets ripped through the walls. Kane's men started using fire, launching flaming arrows onto the roof of the barn. Jacob and Eleanor rushed to put out the small fires with the buckets of water, their faces smudged with soot, their lungs burning. In the middle of the chaos, Eleanor saw one of Kane's men creeping toward a blind spot at the side of the house, a bundle of oil-soaked rags in his hand. Marshall and Jacob were pinned down, unable to see him. Without thinking, Eleanor grabbed Marshall's heavy pistol from the table, ran to the side window, and fired. The kick of the gun nearly broke her wrist, but the shot went true. The man screamed and fell, dropping the torch. Marshall looked at her, a flicker of surprise and respect in his eyes. But their small victory was short-lived. A coordinated assault from 3 sides breached their perimeter. The fight moved from the yard to the barn, then to the porch itself. They were being pushed back inch by bloody inch. Jacob, fighting from the barn, saw a gunman taking aim at Eleanor as she ran back toward the cabin door. "Eleanor, look out!" he screamed. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself in front of her, taking the bullet that was meant for his sister. He crumpled to the ground, a look of shock on his face. Eleanor screamed his name, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "I'm sorry, Elle," he whispered, his hand reaching for hers. Tell them I was sorry." And then he was gone. The grief and rage that filled Eleanor was a white-hot fire. She picked up Jacob's fallen rifle, her tears mixed with the grime on her face. Her brother had died saving her. He had found his redemption. Just then, a voice boomed from outside, a voice of command, of absolute authority. "Marshal Boone, it's over! Come on out, or we burn you out with the girl and the brats!" Silas Kane had arrived. The devil was at the door. The world seemed to fall silent. The gunfire stopped. The only sounds were the crackling of the burning barn and the ragged sound of Eleanor's own breathing. Her brother's body lay cooling in the dirt beside her. The monster was here. Marshall pulled her back inside the cabin, his face a grim mask of fury and grief. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice low. Through a crack in the wall, Eleanor could see him. Silas Kane. He sat on a magnificent black horse, a king surveying his domain. He was older but still powerful, with eyes like chips of flint. And standing beside him, looking pale and terrified, was his son, Miguel. Kane had brought him here to watch, to learn a lesson. "You're a hard man to kill, Boone," Kane shouted, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I should have known you wouldn't die easy. But your luck has run out. You chose the wrong side." "There are no sides with you, Kane," Marshall shouted back, his voice raw. "Only victims." Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, I disagree. There is my side, and there is the side that's about to be buried. I'll give you one last chance. Send out the girl and my grandchildren. I have no quarrel with them. In fact, I've decided to be merciful. They'll be raised as Kanes. Their mother's unfortunate bloodline will be a forgotten secret. They are my legacy, after all. As for you, you can die quick." The sheer arrogance, the absolute evil of his words, stole the air from Eleanor's lungs. He didn't want to kill her children. He wanted to steal them, to erase her and Marshall and Jacob from their lives completely, to raise them as his own, as property. That's when something inside Eleanor snapped. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a pawn. She was a mother, and no one was taking her children. She looked around the ransacked cabin, her eyes wild. Her gaze fell on an old, leather-bound book on a shelf above the hearth, a book she'd seen Marshall look at sometimes but never open. It looked like a ledger. On impulse, driven by a desperate, crazy idea, she grabbed it. Marshall was preparing for a final, hopeless charge. "I'm going out there," he said. "When I do, you take the babies and run for the creek. Don't stop." "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She held up the ledger. "What is this?" He glanced at it, his eyes widening in understanding. "It's a record," he said grimly, "a reminder of the man I used to be. Every job I ever did for him, every debt I collected, every man I broke. It's all in there, names, dates, payments." It was proof of Kane's entire criminal empire, written in the hand of his own enforcer. "He thinks he's won," Eleanor whispered, a plan forming in the fire of her grief. "He's arrogant. He wants to gloat." She walked to the shattered door of the cabin and stepped out into the sunlight, her brother's rifle in one hand, the ledger in the other. She was a terrifying sight, her dress torn and blood-stained, her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. Kane looked surprised to see her. "So, the little mother has some fight in her after all." "You will not take my children," she said, her voice ringing out across the yard, clear and strong. "I'll take whatever I want," Kane sneered. "I own this valley. I own everything in it." "You don't own the truth," Eleanor shot back. She held up the ledger. "And the truth is in this book. Everything you've ever done, Silas Kane. Every family you've ruined. Every man you've had killed. It's all in here, written down by your favorite dog, Marshall Boone." Kane's face went from smug amusement to thunderous rage. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He had forgotten about the meticulous records his enforcer used to keep. "Lies!" he roared. "Burn them! Burn them all!" His men raised their rifles. Miguel looked away, unable to watch. This was it, the end. But just as Kane's men were about to fire, a new sound filled the air, the sound of a bugle. Over the ridge where Kane's army had first appeared, a new group of riders came into view. But these weren't hired guns. They were townsmen, farmers, ranchers, and at their head, wearing a dusty badge, was the county sheriff. Marshall had done more than just fortify the ranch. He had sent a message. Days ago, when they passed through a small settlement, he had paid a young boy to ride for the county seat. He'd sent a message to the one lawman in the territory he thought might still have a spine, telling him that Silas Kane was about to make his move, and that he, Marshall Boone, was ready to testify. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, and it had just paid off. The townsfolk, who had lived in fear of Kane for years, had finally found the courage to fight back. Seeing the sheriff ride out, seeing Kane's army pinned down at the small ranch, they had taken up their own arms and joined him. The tables had turned. Kane's men looked from the small, battered cabin to the small army of determined citizens on the ridge. Their nerve broke. Some of them threw down their guns. Others spurred their horses and fled. Miguel, the ultimate coward, tried to slink away in the confusion, but the sheriff pointed a finger at him. "You're not going anywhere, boy." Silas Kane sat on his horse, his empire crumbling around him in a matter of minutes. He looked from Eleanor, standing defiant with his crimes in her hand, to Marshall, who now stood beside her, and finally to the army of his victims cresting the hill. His reign was over, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Eleanor. "If I'm going down," he screamed, "I'm taking you with me." Two shots rang out at almost the same instant, one from Kane's pistol and one from the rifle in Eleanor's hands. Kane's bullet whizzed past her ear, harmless. Her bullet struck him square in the chest. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his fine coat, a look of utter disbelief on his face. Then he tumbled from his saddle and lay still in the dirt he had fought so hard to own. The silence that followed was absolute. The war was over. The aftermath was quiet. The sheriff and his men rounded up the rest of Kane's gang. Miguel was taken into custody, a whimpering, broken man, his future nothing but a jail cell. Silas Kane's body was loaded unceremoniously onto a wagon. His reign of terror was finished, his empire dismantled by a ledger and the courage of a woman he had dismissed as a stain. Eleanor and Marshall stood in the yard of their battered ranch, the smoke still rising from the smoldering barn. They were exhausted, bruised, and grieving, but they were alive, and they were free. They buried Jacob on a small hill overlooking the cabin, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross. Eleanor said her goodbyes, mourning the brother she had lost but finding peace in the man he had become at the very end. In the days that followed, a new kind of silence settled over the ranch. Not the lonely silence of Marshall's past or the fearful silence of the siege, but a quiet, peaceful silence. The sound of the wind in the grass, the gentle creak of the porch swing, and the soft cooing of two healthy babies. One evening, as the sun dipped low, setting the hills on fire with gold, Eleanor sat on the porch, rocking one of her children while Marshall rocked the other. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. Finally, Eleanor looked at him, at this quiet, steady man who had walked through hell beside her. The man who had once been a monster's tool but had become her savior. Marshall looked at her, then at the children sleeping in their arms, and his rough, calloused hand reached out and gently took hers. "I'm no hero, Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But if you'll have me, I'll stand by you. Always." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes, but for the first time since this nightmare began, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She smiled, a real smile, without any pain behind it. That night, the ranch was no longer a place of exile or a fortress under siege. It was a home built not on blood ties but on choice, on sacrifice, and on a love that had been forged in the hottest of fires. So I have to ask you, what truly makes a family? Is it just the blood that runs through your veins? Or is it the people who choose to stand with you, to fight for you, and to stay when everyone else walks away? If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more tales from the wild pages of history waiting to be told. Stories of grit, betrayal, and the kind of love that can rise from the ashes. Because in the end, this isn't just Eleanor's story. It's a reminder for all of us. No matter how broken your past is, there is always a chance to build a new future. And sometimes, the family we forge on the trail is stronger and truer than the one we were born into.